Okay.
Okay. So, yeah. So, okay. It's December 6th, and um, this is an interview with Paul Goldberg, and we're going to talk about his experiences as a nurse and a union official. And um, Paul, state your name and where you live and where you were born and what year.
So my name's Paul Goldberg. I live in Cottage Grove, Oregon. I have for over 30 years. And I was born in Linwood, California, which is near Los Angeles. Grew up in
Okay.
Los Angeles area.
Okay. And I know that you're a nurse, or you started as a nurse. Um, I know you're retired now. What led you to enter nursing as a career originally? How did you get there?
So I was in college, majoring in psychology, like most people were back in the 70s,
Hmm.
and realized that I couldn't get a job anywhere after I graduated with a
Yeah,
degree in psychology. So I
yeah,
was looking around for a, something that would get me employed. And then, of course, I grew up in the atmosphere of the 70s, the sort of social responsibility, alternative hippie kind of environment. I actually ended up first year of college. I went to University of Southern California, which is a private
yeah.
school, but
Right.
I quickly moved to Antioch in Ohio, which is an alternative work study program
I
school.
I'm an Antioch graduate.
Oh, are you?
I
Ah,
never knew this about you. When did you go to
yeah.
Antioch?
So I went to Antioch in 77, 78. I
Oh, okay.
wasn't on
Okay.
campus very much
Yeah.
because it's work study. So I was there for 3 months when I
Yeah.
first got there,
Yep.
majoring in
Yep.
psychology. Then
Okay.
went to Boston for 6 months, came back to Antioch,
Yeah.
ended up in
Okay.
Berkeley, California for
Okay.
6 months, and then had this epiphany that I wasn't going to be employed if I kept going that way. So
Yeah. Yeah.
switched over to nursing, and of course, not very many men were going into nursing back
Yeah.
then. But I decided I wanted to go to UCLA School of Nursing, which was a
Oh,
very
okay.
small school at that time. So I had to get
Hmm.
prerequisites done at UC San Francisco and then moved back to Los Angeles for
Okay.
a 2 year program to complete a 2 year program in nursing,
All right.
which ended with a Bachelor of Science in Nursing and a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology,
Right.
dual majors. And I have
Yeah.
stories to tell about that, but for another time, maybe.
Well, just we won't pursue the Yellow Springs thing now, but I think it's really interesting that I did not know this about you. But so how long you weren't at Antioch for very long?
It was a 2 year period, but I was only on
Yeah.
campus for maybe
Yeah.
6 months.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I graduated in 74. I
Oh, did you?
graduated right as the strikes were over. It was a really difficult time. It was actually a really good place for me, but it was not a really good place for everybody, I realized.
Yeah, I came in there when they were doing some social experimentation, and they decided that they would bring in a bunch of people from the ghettos
Yeah, new directions.
without
So,
without
yeah,
verified academic success.
yeah.
And then there were a bunch of shootings on campus.
Oh God. That
So
was
it
that
got,
was after my time. But I
yeah,
remember the New Directions program, and I remember the disconnect between. Yeah, there were a bunch of ghetto kids,
yeah,
and
yeah.
uh, okay, well we can talk about that some other time. But so UCLA School of Nursing, you got a Bachelor of Science, and where was your first nursing job?
Well, even at UCLA, I never wanted to live in Los Angeles or be in Los Angeles. So they had uh, an Indian Native American immersion program at the very end that I went to for 3 months uh, up in Northern California. I was still in school. So I went up there for the last 3 months of that program and then graduated. So then I
Uh-huh.
immediately moved up to Cottage Grove, Oregon,
Mm-hmm.
back in '76 and started work. I worked a couple months in the psych unit at Sacred Heart Medical Center in Eugene, but quickly realized that I wanted to do something with all the medical knowledge that because my original idea was to go into psychiatric nurse practitioner and do
Uh-huh.
therapy. That
Uh-huh.
was my route into my interest in psychology.
Mm-hmm.
And so I figured, well, I just graduated, I just learned all this medical information in nursing. I wanted to consolidate what I had learned. So I got this job at Cottage Grove Hospital. And of course,
Mm-hmm.
it was night shift on the long-term care. They had a long-term care wing of the hospital, and I was a newbie, so you go to night shift, and I worked there
Yeah.
for 6 months, and then every 6 months I would move up or move over. So I moved over to the med surge floor night shift, then med surge evening shift, med surge day shift. Then they had a small ICU, so I
Mm-hmm.
moved into there after a couple of years, and uh, ended up being the assistant manager of nursing at the hospital. It's a small hospital.
And tell me a little bit more about, of course, I know there weren't too many men going into nursing then. How did that color your development as a nurse? The fact that it was so gendered then, and how do you reflect on that, especially in the early days?
Yeah, I mean, I think most of the men gravitated towards being charge nurses for whatever reason. You just got either assigned or you stepped up to being, a little bit more in leadership
Mm-hmm.
than the women wanted to do. And I didn't encounter any uh, discrimination or anything like that, or sexual harassment, although there were sexual harassment jokes going around.
Right.
And if anything, people were surprised or questioned my sexuality. Patients
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah.
occasionally, but it was
Odd that
pretty
I have
minor.
a male nurse. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
pretty minor.
Right.
I remember I saved this one guy's life doing CPR, and years later, the woman, I went into the market with my kids and my wife, and his wife was surprised. Oh, I'm so glad that you're not gay. I mean, it's a
Yeah. Right.
rural
Right.
country atmosphere here.
Right.
Um, but I didn't discriminate. I didn't encounter very much discrimination, and it was actually an advantage. On the actual day-to-day work, they would come to me because I was bigger, and nursing is a lot of physical lifting of
Yeah.
patients and moving folks, and so I would be the go-to guy for that. Um, and if there were any mental health issues, where people needed restraint, that kind of thing. Um,
So did that mean that the job was more hazardous for you actually, because they assumed because you were a male that you would get the heavier patient or the patient who was more distraught?
to some degree, it was, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't get injured because I was, young and big,
Mm-hmm.
so I did fine. But there are some smart nurses anyway, that were in leadership positions too. And I stayed at Cottage Grove Hospital for about 10 years full
Mm-hmm.
time. Yeah, but every 6 months I was moving to a new position. And then, uh, as I recall, they had, even back then, there were staffing problems to find adequate numbers of nurses. And so
Mm-hmm.
we would be asked to work stretches of days in a row. And
Yeah.
I mean, it was pretty all encompassing if you were full time. And then when I was assistant nurse manager, as nurses called in sick, I would have to come in on my whatever shift, and I was salaried, and I wasn't making any more money for coming in and filling in for all these shifts. And after about
Right.
6 months of that, I realized that the staff nurses were making more money than I was making as a manager.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of people have that experience, don't they? In different jobs too. It's like,
Yeah.
why would I want to be a manager? But and so was that a union? Was there a union contract there?
There was a
At
union
Cottage Grove?
contract there. And of course, I wasn't active in the union then or there. I was
Hmm.
aware of it. And then I went into management too. So
Yeah, you went out of the unit.
went out of the
Right.
unit. Um, for less than a year, I think, before I realized what I was doing. And then I asked to go back into being a staff nurse, and the current nursing director said, "Oh, we don't do that. We don't allow you to go back in." And I said, "Well, then fine. I'm going to go work at McKinsey-Willamette Hospital." And she said, "No, no, no, don't do that." And
Uh-huh.
I said, it was too late. She had burnt some bridges, and
Uh-huh.
I was pretty burnt out on working so many hours.
So you went to Mackenzie-Willamette in 1986?
Uh, yes, that's correct. Yep.
And and that was all about not wanting to be the charge nurse anymore, the supervisor anymore.
Yeah, and I wanted a bigger challenge too. I mean, this was a very small hospital, and I had
Mm-hmm.
done floating around supervision on they had a pretty good OB unit, the med surge unit, ICU. So I was the day shift supervisor floating between all those units, and it wasn't very challenging after a while. And then the hours, yeah,
Yeah.
created burnout. So
Right.
decided to go to McKinsey. I remember there was a stretch there for 6 months that I was scheduled 7 days a week between Cottage Grove Hospital and McKinsey.
Uh-huh.
I didn't work 7 days a week, but I was scheduled 7 days a week. In nursing, you get uh, placed on low census when there wasn't,
Right.
enough patients. So
And
I
how
would
was
use.
Mackenzie Willamette different than Cottage Grove, both as a hospital, um, in a narrow professional way, and also kind of the work culture? And how did you experience that change going from the smaller rural hospital to the bigger city hospital?
Yeah, I mean, McKinsey was a community hospital that was, I mean, it was much more sophisticated than Cottage Grove. You didn't have to be jack of all trades. Uh, the nurses at Cottage Grove had to know how to go down to the ER and be an ER nurse, be an OB nurse, be an ICU nurse, med surge. At McKinsey, it was more specialized. So I had a job in the intensive care unit. The intensive care unit was much larger. The intensive care unit at Cottage Grove was 3 beds with one swing bed. Uh, and McKinsey Willamette was more of, I believe, 15 beds with
Mm-hmm.
a circular kind of pattern with a desk. Um, uh, I chose to go to McKinsey Willamette because it was the more employee friendly, had a reputation of being a more employee friendly hospital than Peace Health Sacred Heart Medical Center did.
Yeah,
And
and that's something that's kind of changed. It's sort of reversed.
it did change. Back then, it was a not for profit hospital, community based. And I remember the CEO, I was talking to the CEO once, Roy Orr, I think his name was back then. And he said that as the hospital grew and as the medical industry got more and more corporate, he
Mm-hmm.
decided that he was going to leave.
Yeah,
He had enough. So it was no longer knowing all your staff and knowing your coworkers and a small community feel to it. And it turned out that McKinsey-Willamette actually did sell at some point to, I think it was Triad first,
Yeah.
which was a for-profit, I think Tennessee-based corporation.
Do you know
That
what
was,
year that happened?
I think I jotted something down here. I think it was at least 10 years later, 2003
Mm-hmm.
was Triad Hospital. And these hospital consolidations were happening all over the country because independent little hospitals couldn't compete with the larger chains. And that has a whole story to it too. I think Hardy Myers, who was the Attorney General of Oregon, had to get involved with that sale, or we made sure he got involved with it because there were community assets, in a not-for-profit hospital, that they get a tax exempt status for years because they're contributing back to the community in theory.
Right.
And they were. So, but when they sell to a for-profit corporation, that's not their mission anymore, and the law says that they have to then compensate for that in some manner. And I think they did that. They did that by spinning off their home health service, community health, which they did, and it still exists there. So home health is a separate little company that was a result of this merger, and then it sold like 2 or 3 more times after Triad in later years after 2003.
So how did you got more involved with the union at McKinsey-Willamette?
Yeah, fairly quickly. I got more involved with the union.
And how'd that come about?
Well, this was the Oregon Nurses Association was there representing the nurses, and they wanted a rep, a unit rep there, local, for ICU. They were trying to get a rep in each nursing unit, each shift, and so I volunteered for that. It was pretty low key, but I started when I started working there, we were again short-staffed there as well, and they started, as a rep, I got involved with the contract negotiation, one of the contract negotiations, and we talked about instituting something called the Baylor Plan, which was a 3 12-hour shifts. You work 3 12-hour shifts, 36 hours, you get paid for 40. And it was an incentive to retain nurses and to make it more worker friendly, and they were willing as a facility to experiment with that, which was good. And the twist with them was they only did it on the weekends, so the 3 12-hour shifts were Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So I worked Friday, Saturday, Sunday, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. Every weekend. And I didn't realize that would screw with my social life completely. I mean, there was everyone, because the following day after that, you're totally burnt out and have to sleep all day. So it burns up kind of 4 days of your week.
But now the nurses or the union were in favor of that experimentation. That wasn't driven by management.
That's correct. Yeah. No, it was a good deal for us. This was before everyone moved to 12-hour shifts. Primarily now, all nursing shifts are 12-hour shifts.
Oh, okay. So this was an experimental period, and the feeling was the incentive gave you 4 days off. I mean, it was a straight ahead. Yeah.
And now, if you lived out of the area and you wanted to commute in, it was a little bit easier. And it was more concentrated. So typically when you were working 8-hour shifts, you ended up staying overtime anyway by 1 or 2 hours just to complete your charting. So if you're going to do that, you might as well stay 12 hours and get paid for it. and then
Yeah.
get this 11% bonus is what it came out to be.
Yeah. So, and was the overtime, how long did that go on for there, that the Baylor plan?
I think it may still be in effect. I
Uh-huh.
mean, not with the differential, because the differential, they did away with that years later.
Right. Right.
But they still have 12-hour shifts, and they still have, the union had to put a cap on the number of shifts you could work, because
Right.
they kept pushing to schedule you more and more. And we determined it was unsafe to schedule for more than 4 in a row, even
Right.
if they were paying overtime.
Right.
And there was one guy, Greg, who, a night shift nurse I was working with, he worked 10 12-hour shifts in a row.
Oh my God.
And even they had to admit that was, they had a policy against it, but then they had no choice but to keep calling people in. And a
Yeah.
lot of time is still what is happening. I mean, it's amazing that even today, they'll come out with policies for safety reasons that nurses shouldn't be scheduled more than, X 48 hours, 50, 60 hours a week. And then they'll just go ahead and keep calling you anyway.
Yeah. So
And
the standard now, the 12-hour shift is a standard in the entire industry in the country, basically.
yes, in the acute care facilities, they actually they try to do staggered shifts starting at different times. It's not all 7 a.m., 7 p.m.
Right.
They also try with the older nursing population. There was a push to swing back to 8-hour shifts.
Right.
And so some of these units these days have mixes of 8s and 12s. And then for retiree nurses, they're trying to get back to work. They'll even allow them to come in for a 4-hour shift for relief
Right.
work.
Right.
Depending on in Oregon, it depends on what we negotiated in the contracts.
Right. But I'm thinking here that this whole period in the 80s is also when some of the manufacturing contracts that had always been 8-hour shifts, 40-hour weeks with these overtime provisions, time and a half and double times, all this formula that came out of kind of the World War II era, really. This is when, even in manufacturing, they start wanting people to do 10s, 4 10s. And 4 10s is pretty standard in a lot of industries now. And of course, there was pushback about that. There were strikes, pretty bitter strikes about it. But it sounds like there was never a lot of resistance to it in nursing, because the trade-off was, the 312s at 40 hours pay. So that incentivizes the long shift in a different way than what happened to paper workers. I think the paper workers are the ones I think about, but people generally like, and within nursing, people felt like a 12-hour shift was not a danger, was not unsafe.
For years, when we took votes of the bargaining units of the nurses, there was always some split, some nurses saying it was too much, but for the most part, people didn't want to have to come in 5 days a week to commute to the hospital. And so they were receptive to it. In later years, over the past 15, 20 years, as the nurses aged, the population aged, there was pushback by the nurses to offer at least some 8-hour shifts for people. And that was, we negotiated that, and there was resistance to that from hospitals.
Yeah. And how would you describe at Willamette your relationship with your coworkers and with the management there?
I think it was good. Nursing is an interesting field, and working in hospitals is interesting because it's sort of a paramilitary structure. You know, you're taking orders, and there's a
Yeah.
hierarchy with the physician comes in, and you sort of cater to, you know, the physician, but and then you record the orders, and it's you know, very regimented kind of system. But I was working the night shift. The night shift, of course, has less direct contact with the administration. You know, the nurse manager and
Right.
and the administrators, and so some nurses preferred to work the night shift so that they didn't get into the politics of it.
Right.
It's a very um, the units, you know, you have your coworkers. We got along fine, and but there's always gossip, and there's always one or two nurses that are being gossiped about. And, you know, it's kind of a social unit, each nursing unit and each nursing shift. And so you're either supported by your coworkers, or you're hung out to dry sometimes. And new nurses coming in have to be vetted, particularly in places like surgery. ICU, we were you know, pretty focused on the patients, and very busy when you're in there. And staffing wasn't a tremendous issue because it was always 1-to-1, 1-to-2, 1-to-3 patients, always.
So staffing, when you were at Mackenzie Willamette, staffing was not yet an issue in nursing?
It was, in the sense that they kept asking us to work additional shifts, but the major fights on staffing, even to today, are on med surg units, and through the years in nursing, the structure kept changing. So you at some points in nursing history, they'd advocate a team approach. So you'd have the nurse, a CNA, and even an LPN, which is a 1-year certificate. Then that would be promoted as a team approach. That was what was happening in Cottage Grove when I first arrived. Then they realized the LPNs weren't value added, so they started phasing them out, making it RNs and CNAs. They tried doing primary care with no CNAs at some point. So then they had nurses emptying trash cans and changing beds and doing baths. And for the past 20 years, probably, they've been talking about nurses working to the scope of their license, which is code for not really doing patient care, doing charting and supervision, basically, as much as possible. And then hiring back some CNAs to do some of this other unskilled, less skilled work.
So they pushed work onto you and then retracted it. They got rid of the LPNs, and now they want them back.
Yeah, they keep going through cycles of that, and they've never quite figured it out yet, even, because, you know, at some point, I'm not sure where they're at now. They said that all RNs would have to have their bachelor's degree. So there's different. You have to have a 2-year degree to be a 2-year degree to be an RN in Oregon.
Yeah.
But many have 4-year, you know, Bachelor of Science degrees. So I'd say probably 15 years ago, 20 years ago, they started phasing in and saying that all nurses that they hire would have to have a bachelor's degree, a 4-year degree. And that made sense because medicine had gotten more complex, nursing had gotten more complex, but they couldn't do it. OHSU up in Portland, Peace Health, even Mackenzie Willamette couldn't pull off having just 4-year degrees as a prerequisite. They couldn't
Right.
find enough nurses. Then they finally did it. I don't know, maybe 10 years ago as a policy, and got it working for a few years, but now I don't think they're holding on to that either. So they're hiring 2-year trained nurses with a promise of helping them get to their bachelor's degree.
Uh-huh.
So I think that's the status right now. And
Right.
but they had staffing problems 37 years ago in Cottage Grove Hospital. We had patients lining the halls and not in rooms. McKinsey-Willamette, they had staffing issues back then as well. I think it's now post-COVID, I think it's even worse, and they're relying on these traveler nurses to come in and pay
Were
them.
you still on the clock at the beginning of the pandemic, or were you done?
I was done, fortunately.
Yeah. Good. Boy,
Yeah.
I just can't imagine. Oh, well, I talked a little bit with Courtney about. I've talked to Courtney a couple times, little conversations, and I know I get a little taste of it. And I was just over in Bend and talking with this rep over there, Renee Ruiz, about how things had changed and what it was like during COVID, and just, yeah, it's good that you're probably glad you didn't have to deal with all that stuff. Oh,
Yeah.
membership
There
must
was
have been
the
just
PPE, there was the
tearing it up.
equipment issues, and then
Yeah.
and then nurses not being told different stories about well, it was unknown how
Yeah.
dangerous it was,
Yeah.
but and then the staffing that resulted from nurses leaving after a while.
Yeah. Well, what did you find were the most satisfying things about your work back in that time when you were at McKinsey, and what did you find the most challenging?
Well, I think the working every weekend was challenging, just the mechanics of it, but the work itself was more technical up there than in Cottage Grove. They had various types of cardiac catheterizations going in through jugular veins, and elsewhere that you had to monitor, and various cardiac drips that I had to learn. So it was much more technical than Cottage Grove was. They had more complex patients. They did not have cardiac monitors back then. They had cardiac monitors, but they didn't have people monitoring the monitors, technicians monitoring the monitors like they do now. Now the nurses aren't watching, the cardiac electrocardiogram images, and now they have techs doing that, and then they notify the nurses if there's a problem.
Right.
So the technical aspects were more complicated, but the camaraderie with nurses was good on the night shift, particularly. More political on the day shift, which is typical in most organizations.
Yeah. Because there are more managers around and the public is in and out.
Right. Families were in and out more during the day. Managers are in and out trying to implement whatever pet program they were working on at the time.
Right.
And then this was about the same time, 30 years ago, when they started implementing computerized patient records.
Right.
So the computers became a big part of work. And there were a number of starts and stops at every facility that I was aware of, that it was much more complex and much more expensive to implement these computer systems. The computerized medical records cost as much as the hospitals to build. I mean, the cost was the same. You could build a hospital, or you could implement this computerized record. And they would implement it. And I remember out at St. Charles, the whole thing crashed after a year. At McKinsey, we had problems, and Sacred Heart Peace Health had problems in Eugene with their computer systems, and they had to, junk or buy other programs within a couple years.
Yeah.
I think some facilities, I think McKinsey might have been one that actually bought their computers rather than leased them, which was a mistake
Yeah.
because the technology, changes so rapidly that they have to.
Well, and
They
there's a whole training regime. I mean,
oh yeah,
I've watched my last three doctors. I've had three doctors in not very long.
yeah,
And there were good doctors actually, but they were all on their way out the door because of what's going on. But I just remember watching these people who are, a few of them were in my age group, and trying to learn
yeah,
their systems. And it was just, I couldn't do it. Or they could do it, but it was very difficult. And then I started having people going to doctors where there was a transcriber. I don't know
yeah,
whether that's standard now. I mean, that seems like a huge waste of resources, but what do you want your doctor doing? Paying attention to the computer screen or paying attention to you? You
yeah,
know,
yeah.
um,
There was nursing
um,
pushback, particularly from the older nurses about the computer
yeah,
systems. And I
yeah,
remember some ultimatums coming down, both from McKinsey and Peace Health, that by X date, by 6 months from now or a year from now, you have to be computer literate and you can't be taking
yeah,
notes. But the implementation was not smooth by any means. And for
right,
instance, we have cardiac strips that print out tape, that prints out the heartbeat, and then on OB that prints out the contractions. And they just didn't consult with the right people when they were implementing the computers. So those two machines couldn't record it electronically. They couldn't put it in the medical record. So they ended up having to have a paper record in OB
yeah.
and ICU just to tear these things off and put them somewhere, you know.
And that whole revolution in medical technology. I mean, there are computers before the mid '80s, but I'm thinking about my own experience with computers. That when you're at McKinsey Willamette is really when that stuff starts to snowball, isn't it?
Yes.
Would you say? Yeah.
Yeah. And some of the facilities were trying to overreach and implement. Um, they wanted all the patient record, the physician's ordering record, lab orders, all of it to be integrated somehow.
Yeah.
And
Right.
so they sort of overreached on it, and
Yeah.
they couldn't quite get it. And there were a number. It was a period of probably 5 to 10 years that these various
Yeah.
hospitals around the state of Oregon tried and tried, and
Yeah.
some of them got it right, and it's still, some of these systems are hindrances to what the nurses are trying to do. You
Right.
have to go through 3 or 4 screens to just do a simple anything, to
Yeah.
record.
Right.
Um, they also invented a Pyxis machine, which is tracking patient narcotics. So you have to put either your thumbprint or fingerprint onto it to get into it, and
Uh-huh.
and it tracks very closely what the nurses do with controlled substances.
Right.
Um, and that was phased in a little bit after that. It's not.
And did you have a lot of, being a union representative, did you have a lot of, how would you describe the nature of labor management disputes during that era? I mean, you just mentioned one. I can imagine. I mean, really bad stuff can happen if you've got a bad paper trail on some narcotics, for instance. But how would you describe the typical problems that you face as a unit rep? What were they about?
Well, you get, they fall into the normal categories, either scheduling, vacation, holiday, sick time kinds of
Mm-hmm.
disputes, or practice disputes, where the nurse has done something either negligent or to the detriment of the patient, or alleged,
Yeah.
and then you have to walk that through and walk through. McKinsey Willamette was pretty responsive. You know, the administration back then, I think the director of nurses, Kathy Deacon, was pretty open and wanted to do the right thing frequently. I can give you a couple examples. The one was with home health. The nurses there were being felt they had to not chart all the hours that they were putting in home health. You know, because they're driving around visiting people, and they thought, oh, well, this isn't part of work. And as a rep, I had to say, hey, no, it is. It's part of work, you know, from the time you arrive in the morning till the time you check out. But consistently, all of them, and this was common with home health nurses throughout the state, they weren't putting down their hours because they felt they were fairly isolated from one another. They didn't talk to one another. They were overwhelmed with the amount of patients and work.
Right.
And so they felt inadequate, that it was somehow their fault that they weren't completing, you know, or meeting the productivity standard. And so they didn't put down their hours. So we filed a grievance over that, but we first had to get them all meeting together and talking together. So we got them together off campus at a nurse's home, talked to them about that. When they realized that everyone was doing it, they had an epiphany and said, no, you know, we want to be paid for.
Right.
I said, you know, you're all good nurses. You've all been here 20 years plus. How do you come to the conclusion that you're all not, you know, functioning up to their standards? Well, it turns out their standards were not correct. So we approached McKinsey Willamette with that. And we were doing that at various facilities around the state. And I believe Peace Health just shut us down and not talk to us about it. And it was difficult to prove in an arbitration setting. We started heading towards an arbitration with McKinsey Willamette, but Kathy Deacon saw the logic of all that, and we also threatened that it was a violation of law. You know, it wasn't just a violation of contract; it was a violation of law not to be recording your hours.
Right. And now back then, in the mid '80s, what was Burton White the labor relations guy at the ONA then?
This was during Ken Fitzsimon. Burton White. It was
Burton White. Yeah. Ken.
Yeah.
So it goes Burton and then Ken.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And then you. Okay. Yeah. All right. Yeah. I've forgotten about Ken.
Well, let me finish the home health to finish that one. Kathy Deacon decided that we didn't have to go to arbitration over this, and we came to a negotiated settlement for back pay going back 6 months. And we relied just upon what the nurses' recollections were of how many hours they put in. So she was very employee friendly that way, as compared to other facilities in the state, which that was the only that type of settlement that we came to. Now with Ken Fitzsimon, it was interesting. When I worked at McKinsey Willamette, I ended up working as a staff nurse in ICU for 5 years approximately. But most of that time was it was a project where the Oregon Nurses Association wanted a staff representative, labor representative nurse, half-time outside of Portland, so regionally, one down here and one in Eastern Oregon. And this was Ken Fitzsimon thought this up to get better representation outside of Portland. And so I was the first one on, you know, that applied for that, and they were specifically looking for a nurse. And so I ended up the 5 years that I was at McKinsey Willamette, 4 of those as a staff nurse, were half-time as a staff nurse in ICU and half-time working for the Oregon Nursing Association. And I had to get permission from Kathy Deacon or the administration to do that because at times there was conflict of interest.
Yeah. I would
in
think
fact,
that would be a very complicated changing of your hats too. I mean, and
sometimes
that must have been difficult.
it was interesting. And Ken didn't make it easier for me, believe me. I was the rep. He said I had to do, I think this was in the first year that I did this. I was working night shift ICU on this Baylor plan, and I was talking up joining the ONA with my coworkers,
Yeah.
and I got disciplined for it. I got disciplined for talking about ONA while at work.
At
And
Mackenzie Willamette.
at
Yeah.
McKinsey Willamette, ICU. And I filed a grievance over that. I said, no, you can't discipline me because on night shift, we're just trying to stay awake. We're talking about everything. We're talking about our family.
Yeah.
We're talking about politics. We're talking about
Anything
anything and
that keeps us
everything.
awake.
And I was just talking, union.
Yeah.
And they said, no, we're going to take it all the way to arbitration. And they took it all the way to arbitration. And Ken comes down and says, well, you're the rep. You do the arbitration. And I said, I'm going to do the arbitration for me. I'm the one that's disciplined. And I'm working. I'm going to be sitting. You're going to be sitting beside me as my labor director. And Kathy Deacon's going to be sitting across from me as my administrator. And I'm going to do the presentation. And I'm a young shit, I'm in my 30s and had never done an arbitration.
Right.
And I did it. And I won,
So you were the advocate for yourself?
Yes.
Basically?
Yeah. Yeah. That was Ken's idea of throwing him into the fire.
What a bonehead idea, Ken. Is Ken still alive? I haven't heard anything about him.
Actually.
He's gone.
Yeah, he's gone. But he was pleased with how ONA went, after he left, and he would check in periodically. But
he hung out a shingle as an arbitrator for a while, I think, didn't he? Because he had a legal training. But now I'm imagining that he was really big on having you because you're a nurse. Because I've always heard, just tangentially, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I've always heard that going into the ranks to find a rep is difficult. That nurses don't want to do it. Is that correct?
They don't have the skill set to do it, so it's really two different. It's on the job training. When I went into it, there were no other nurses doing it on the ONA staff. Diane Hedrick was the other one in Eastern Oregon that was hired at the same time as I was. And it turned out that she and I were very successful in this role. It's been hit and miss since then, but we always preferred to have an RN because you have immediate credibility when you walk into a room. And I would walk in with Ken, and Ken would be the attorney, and he would be, speaking like an attorney to some issue. And then he'd introduce me, and then the whole group would want to talk to me because I was familiar with what they were going through on a day-to-day basis.
And Diane's last name was
Hedrick. Yeah.
I remember her a little bit.
Yeah, I'm sure you've met her.
Yeah.
She was around.
So that was unusual. And so what, you got disciplined for talking union? What, you got a reprimand?
Yeah, a written reprimand. It was either verbal or written. I don't recall, but we had to go through the whole arbitration process, and then we won, and it was just thrown out.
Well, I might have met you around that time because I'm thinking that you came to one of our arbitration institutes kind of early on.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
And did you like doing arbitration? Was that something that, when shifting a little bit to Well, let me just get that transition. So you were half-time, and then you went to full-time, and then you
Yeah.
went to became the staff director. Or what was, how did that
years.
play
I
out?
did another 10 years full time for ONA. So I did, this 5 year period was sort of half and half, McKinsey Willamette staff
Yeah.
nurse and labor rep for ONA. Then I moved to another 5 years, so 10 years total of working for ONA, where I represented many other hospitals in this area. So I
Right.
represented Sacred Heart, I represented Coos Bay Area Hospital. I went down to Roseburg and represented Mercy Medical Center, went over to Bend and represented St. Charles Medical Center, and then continued to represent Cottage Grove Hospital. And so I had a larger area when I went full time, obviously, with ONA. And then, yes, then after that, I moved to be the director of the whole state labor program for ONA.
What year was that you became director?
86. I believe it was 86. Does that make sense? No.
That would have been the year that you went to. I thought that was the year you went to McKenzie Willamette.
Oh, that's right, 86.
So it'd have to be like in 90, 91.
Right, I think
no.
that's correct. 90 or 91.
But then you said you did 10 years as a rep. Does that mean you didn't become director until around 2000?
I think it was 2006.
Okay, that would make more sense.
Yeah, 2006.
Let me ask you a little tangential question about St. Charles, because I've just been over in Bend. And when did they become such a renegade employer? Sounds like they're bad news. Were they always like that?
No, they weren't. They were always very idiosyncratic. They were kind of odd group out there always. They would claim that they were the best hospital in the world, not in the city, not in the state, in the United States, but in the world. And then they sort of had eccentric CEOs that thought they had to invent everything from scratch, and take credit for it. But they were tolerable. They were good. I mean, they had high expectations, but then they went downhill again. Probably 25 years ago, they started. They had to deal with the money issues, deal with the pressure. So they hire harder HR reps, and their goal was to control the money. And so then their policies became more and more stringent.
Right.
But yeah, they have a reputation. Most of the hospitals these days have a reputation of being hard to work for, and not employee friendly. And I don't know how much of that is by circumstance, by the industry circumstance that it's imposed upon them, or it's just the profit motive, even though many are still not-for-profit facilities.
Right. And McKenzie Willamette in particular, you were working there after 10 years at Cottage Grove. So you were there 5 years, and some of that was this transition to being a union rep. The last time you were working full-time as a nurse was at McKenzie Willamette, and that's a hospital which began as a community nonprofit and then became a for-profit, and then was sold several, as you pointed out, you said was sold several times.
Yes.
So how do you reflect, and you're thinking about nursing generally, hospitals as businesses generally, but McKenzie Willamette in particular, if you look back at that, what do you think are the most significant changes that happened Mackenzie Willamette in the community and in nursing over time? Is it about becoming a profit-making institution? Is it about the technology of nursing?
I mean, all of those had very significant impacts. The going to a for-profit status, they at one point were the only for-profit hospital in the state of Oregon, which is unusual. Now there's McMinnville and a few others, but in that process, our negotiations and the attention to what the employees had to say about work or had input about work became much less. They had a Tennessee-based lawyer come in and basically stonewall us from that point forward. He simply would put out his proposal and say, "This is it, take it, leave it. We're not negotiating." And then we would want to talk about nursing and working conditions around equipment or staffing, and he would say to the nurse exec, you can deal with this. I'm not even going to sit at the table. You talk about nursing to the nurses, and do whatever you want. But when it comes down to the bottom line, I'll fly back in from Tennessee for the one day and tell them no. No, you can't have competitive raises. No, you can't. Whatever had any economic impact whatsoever. Now, the way nursing in the state of Oregon worked was Eugene area was paid 10% less than the Portland area, and Cottage Grove was paid 10% behind them. So Cottage Grove was about 20% behind Portland, and then the Eugene area back then was about 10% behind the Portland metro area. The ONA and the nurses fought against that. And as the nursing shortage became more and more apparent, that they had to draw nurses down to recruit them, we got pay equity eventually between the Eugene area and Portland.
And were Mackenzie Willamette and Sacred Heart on par as far as wages?
They leapfrogged each 2 years. Yes, Mackenzie always was just slightly either above or below Mackenzie Willamette. Mackenzie Willamette was slightly above or below Sacred Heart, and vice versa.
Let me ask you. This is very helpful for me. One last thing about this. When you say we wanted to talk about nursing and the bean counter guy or the lawyer guy, they don't want to talk about that, or they want to defer that. But at least in the last years I was in labor education, the question of certainly wages were always important, but staffing ratios became this kind of hot issue, and there were different approaches to it. I remember, I think you and I talked about this before, about whether to legislate it or whether to negotiate it. And of course, the California Nurses Association had kind of like their perspective on it, and I think we had a different perspective in Oregon. But what were your discussions like at Mackenzie Willamette about how? I mean, there was a question of how long the day is, staffing, like the macro view of staffing, and then there's like the micro view of staffing as far as how many nurses per patient or in a particular ward, right? So it's a patient per nurse or nurse per patient ratio. What were the discussions like about that?
Yeah, I mean, back when I worked there, that was just considered a management right. Staffing was management's right.
Yeah.
But it evolved. I mean, nurses flexed their muscle a little bit when it became apparent that it was more than that. I mean, they were basically advocating for their patients more than themselves. I remember at Peace Health, one contract we had, which was the much bigger hospital in Eugene, Springfield, we put it to the nurses whether they wanted a raise or whether they wanted staffing, uh, uh, better staffing ratios, and they voted for better staffing and to forego a raise, which was incredible at the time. But now so to answer your question, it wasn't on the bargaining table back then, when I worked there. Over the years, starting, 25 years ago, probably, there was more and more literature in nursing journals that working over a 12-hour shift was dangerous. It resulted in patient injury, it resulted in more patient deaths. And we got more and more actual scientific studies to document that.
Right.
And we went to the legislature and we started down a parallel path to the California Nurses Association about trying to control staffing. And we've gone full circle by 5 years ago. I think we're now in favor of ratios as well as the California nurses are. So
ratios in the agreement.
In the agreement.
Yeah.
So
that's because the legislative strategy was not as strong a strategy, or
there is no great strategy for this because the hospitals tend to put in place, even the California Nurses Association, for instance, had in place ratios, particularly on the med-surg unit, how many patients to how many nurses. But then the hospitals wouldn't abide by that, and they'd have wildcat strikes, basically. And it was strike after strike. And, when there aren't sufficient staff, there aren't sufficient staff. There's no solution to that, really.
Right.
Other than you say, you cut off admissions to the hospital. And, that's not tenable unless you have some other hospital it can be shipped to. So even now, and then you have the pandemic, where the governor declares a state of emergency and all the staffing regs are out the door anyway. All of our work for 15 years to get legislation into a collaborative staffing committee where nurses truly had power and a voice in what those staffing numbers should look like. We got that into law, and then along comes the pandemic and not sufficient staff, and it's been waived for the past 4 years now. So we are pushing for stronger legislation, but even if you get stronger legislation, it can still be waived in emergencies.
Now,
I don't know, it's a difficult situation.
In the years that you were with the ONA, did you folks had a few strikes? You had help at OHSU.
Yes, we did. This is 2010. We had a big strike.
And then, but not at Mackenzie-Willamette.
I don't believe we had a strike. We had an informational picketing there several times. But
now there was a piece out. There was a Sacred Heart strike, like in the 70s.
Yes. Right? Yeah.
OHSU is the one I can think of. Were there any other notable ones?
There were other actions down at Mercy Medical Center. We had an informational picket, and they closed their doors a year after we did that. They sold out to a corporation and then closed their doors completely a few years later. So that sort of stemmed from our informational picketing. We did the informational picket out at St. Charles several times. And we have had smaller labor disputes, strikes, several day strikes, but nothing as big as OHSU and Sacred Heart.
Did you ever have to manage a wildcat situation?
No, I didn't. I mean, I think we we were pretty good representatives of the nurses, and we're pretty on top of what was
Yeah.
going on, up until recently, and uh, had some pretty good rapport with the administrations over the years, or at least a
Yeah.
rapport, I would say.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this last question, and then we'll go off the record, and you can tell me about
Okay.
about other things. Looking at your job or looking back on your career, do you have any additional reflections or observations about what the work meant to you and its impact on your own life?
Um, I think the staff nurse piece of my profession fit in fairly well with my values and my goals. I did better yet when I went into the labor movement, and uh, could influence where nursing grew. I mean, I was very committed uh, to this profession. Um, so it was like a craft union. So I was very much into, and there was this dichotomy, as you know, in nursing between unionism and professionalism.
Yeah.
And that was always a discussion with nurses. Nurses weren't in it; they were mostly in it for patient care and patients,
Right.
and not self-serving. Um, that's the whole basis of the nursing profession, is to being selfless and giving towards
Right.
others. And it has this religious bent, and it has this military bent, but it also
Yeah.
has during the time I was in nursing, a very strong social
Sure.
underpinning, you know,
Yeah.
and community underpinning. Now, I don't know where community has gone these days. It's out the window
Yeah.
in a lot of
But
respects.
I would think that the big victory would be having a member who started as solely being the professional, but who learned to integrate why unionism was necessary for their professionalism. I mean, I would think that would be the jackpot as far
Yeah,
as
and we did a great job of integrating those two at ONA while I was
yeah,
director. But it took a lot of energy on my part to reach out to
yeah,
the
right,
professional nurses, and to keep pointing out to them that there wasn't a difference between the two. I mean, it's one and the same. It's advocacy for
yeah,
both the patient and for the profession and for the nurses.
right,
So,
yeah,
I mean, it was very satisfying for me to you know, be able to see the progress of nursing, and to gain the respect of not only the nurses but the administration,
right.
just because of my style and the way I did it.
Mhm.
Um, Near the end of that, I was being offered positions to move into Peace Health Administration, and
Right.
I rejected that. But uh,
Even after you were the director for the labor relations director for ONA, people were trying to
yeah,
take you into hospital administration.
yeah,
Oh,
we
interesting.
had a big project down in Cottage Grove, where Cottage Grove Hospital was going bankrupt, and Sacred Heart was called in to manage them, which was
Uh-huh.
ludicrous at the time, because they were competitors.
Right.
And and then within 6 months of them coming down into Cottage Grove, they decided to shut them down. Well, I
Uh-huh.
took the bargaining unit down here of 50 nurses, and we did a 2-year campaign uh, fighting the shutdown. Called in the Attorney General of the state of Oregon again, put roadblocks in, uh, did our own research. We were going to open up our own hospital down here. We did fundraising drives. We had a big thermometer downtown. We went very public for 2 years, and I was the president of Citizens Supporting Healthcare. But really, it was a combination of the bargaining unit, of nurses, the local economy that relied on the hospital, and ONA. All of us were working in tandem. And we pulled off quote unquote saving the hospital by discovering a little known or used law in the state of Oregon, critical access hospitals. That was Cottage Grove Hospital became the first critical access hospital in the state of Oregon, which meant that they got 100% reimbursement for Medicare rather than 80%. Which actually allowed all the rural hospitals in the state of Oregon to adopt the same model and to survive rather than going under. At least that was for
wow. Well, that's a very significant accomplishment. I mean, I would think that would list very high on your.
Yeah, no, I felt very proud of that. And Susan King, who's the executive director of ONA, had told me she had a similar project, and she said, "You realize you're going to fail on this. You're not going to succeed." She was trying to save a school locally up in Portland, and wasn't successful. And she was very pleased, and I was very pleased that we did that. But after that, we had gained bankruptcy status. Citizens Supporting Healthcare had gained standing in the court. And at the very end, we cut an agreement with Peace Health to build a new little facility down here. It's a much watered down facility than what I wanted or what the community wanted. But because of that, they had a lot of respect for me because I didn't push them to the mat, and but also our skill. They were amazed at what this community could do. I mean, we turned out 4,000 people at the high school at one point. We were working with the what's the name of the organization? Rural Health Project.
Yeah.
Organizing Project.
Yeah, rural organizing project. Yeah.
Yeah. So they became involved as well.
Yeah.
We were pulling anyone and everyone where we could get.
And so that effort, when did that occur exactly?
Around 1998 or so.
Okay. This sounds like another whole story we might go into, but well, this has been very helpful for me. Let me, this is great. I'm going to go off the record here, so I'm going to stop.
Sure.
You'll see this.